to Southern Oaks Baptist Church and the first concert of the 35th season for the Tyler Community Band. I'm Richard York, and I will be your host for today's concert. Now, before we start, I first want to invite to the podium. This new director's podium that you see tonight, first time it was used, was built for the Tyler Community Band as part of the Eagle Scout project. This is one of two podiums that were built by Eli Ballard, Boy Scout Troop 370, profiting two nonprofit bands to serve our community. Mr. Ballard, stand up and be recognized. You ladies in the audience, if you want a podium to direct your husband and kids, Eli is there. All right, it's time to turn off your phones, things that make noise, and begin our program. Double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Now you remember that quote from Shakespeare and Macbeth. It has nothing to do with tonight's program, except it has to do with the title of the famous musical, Wicked, and the music from Wizard of Oz. I'll tell you more about that later. But to get started, if you'll please stand as you are able, and welcome to the podium our director, Mr. Mike Holbrook, as the band plays our national anthem. The movie and Wizard the Musical are prequels to The Wizard of Oz. So all of today's tunes come from those two productions. Now, the band's president, Cheryl Hale, who also authors our notes for the announcer, she approached Kelly Bennett, who is our resident composer, about the prospect of doing a commission for this concert, since it is opening for the season. He said he actually had a work that was all ready to be launched and suggested that Cheryl take a listen. Well, as she did, she could hear tornadoes and the feel of liveliness like the Munchkins, and the deal was struck. Kelly came up with the title and the piece was formed. So now, the world premiere of Kelly Bennett's Journey to the Emerald City. I've got a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. The Wizard's Dorothy was from a farm in Kansas, but no town was ever specified. And strangely enough, in Wicked the Musical, Dorothy's role was extremely marginalized. So, we're going to hear next a lively two-step march that was composed by Warren Pryor, who happened to be John Philip Sousa's most famous soloist. And it has a new arrangement for modern band. It's full of fun musical effects like cowbell solos, all right, trombone glissandos, and a lively part for a woodblock. All right, this is an authentic resetting of the heyday of the march, so here's to Kansas.
Thank you.
Bandmasters Association sponsored an annual melody writing competition. Then they would take the winning melody, hire it out to be composed for a band, and then they would provide the piece free to all the band around the state. 2017's winner was a melody by Quentin Porter, who was a junior then at Timber Creek High School in Fort Worth. And it was premiered by the United States Air Force Band of the West during the 2017 Texas Bandmasters Convention. The twist on Wicked is that it's told from the perspective of Elfalda. She was the young woman that attended the Land of Oz's She's University. And that name, obviously, came from Frank Baum, the writer of the original books. Now, can you imagine the most wicked person you've ever heard for and rooting for? Well, that's exactly what Stephen Schwartz, who did the musical, wants us to believe. Life is not always as it seems. Sometimes a change of perspective changes everything, like the devil's perspective. piece is by the Russian composer Peter Tchaikovsky. Dance of the Jesters was composed by him as incidental music for a ballet called The Snow Maidens. Now, this ballet is not the one that we're familiar with by Hans Christian Andersen, but it's based on a contemporary Russian fantasy play, Zignarushka, which is Russian for snow maiden. And it's an incredibly lively affair that has stood out from all the songs and dances and choruses of all the rest of the ballet. It captures the color and zest of typical Russian folk dance. Now, the connection to Wicked and Dorothy and the Yellow Brick Road is that in the musical Wicked, there is a character, Pierre, who is described as a young, empty-headed man who just wants to be dancing through life. And his famous quote in the musical is, "Life is more painless when your brains." Now you can guess which of the characters he played. Take a guess. I think Tchaikovsky would be pleased. Dance of the Jesters. I was looking at the pieces that the band had picked for tonight's concert, the theme of Wizard of Oz, and green witches and yellow brick road, and here I found Elton John. Okay, Cheryl, then I had to read the script to see what the connection is. And you all know Elton John, a legendary pop icon for years, and has just given a wealth of hit songs for 30 years that he's been composing. So this is a retrospective of some of his works, like Saturday Night's All Right, The Fight, Candle in the Wind, Crocodile Rock. Here's the segue. His piece, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. So that's the connection. Thank you, Cheryl. Let's hear something from Elton John. certainly hear that. You know, it's taken 35 years for the band to get this far. I can't imagine there are many community bands that have 35 years behind them. Last year, they incorporated and became their own, honest to gosh, nonprofit 501c3. And they also, last year, began inviting their audiences to participate in covering some of the expenses of the band. They came up with the Holy Snare Drum here, where audience members, if they like, can contribute. Last season, I believe they bought the chimes. Anyway, very nice. So if you would like to do that, just walk up here near the band, near the drum, and it will snare your money. It'll take 15 minutes to get over that. Come back in 15. Larger and younger. Best friends forever, Marge. I suspect that a lot of composers start their careers composing tunes for their student groups that they might lead. Customizing for their strings and witnesses just makes sense. Joseph Campello is one of these who started there and eventually moved on to composing for everybody's students. And he's now retired from teaching, but he's composing full-time the Carl Fisher Company, which has been publishing music for over 150 years. And you remember the story of the two witches, Galinda and Elphaba. It's hard to imagine that they were ever friends, or much less roommates in college. In the story, Galinda and Elphaba start out as bitter enemies, but in the end, they are best friends forever. So let's hear that transition as we welcome to the podium Valerie Cosa as she leads the Tyler Community Band and the Tyler Area Christian Educators Band in Best Friends Forever. And she is not only merely dead, she is really most sincerely dead. And then the Munchins break into song of joy and relief with Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. In this arrangement of that classic song, it has three different styles. The first is presented in the original style, you'll recognize that. And then it comes out as a ballad and finally wraps up as a Viennese waltz. It's the classic. You've never heard it this way before. So let's see what you can do with this, Mr. Holwood.
Richard, hang on a second. I got something quick off the script. We like to celebrate birthdays in the band, and this hasn't happened yet, so I thought we would get it to where we could have everybody participate in wishing this person a happy birthday. Come here, Amanda. Amanda's son is also the one that headed this Eagle Scout project, so thank you for that. But Amanda's got a birthday coming up, and while it's not polite to divulge a lady's name, when you turn 50, which she's not. But anyway, would you all just join us in singing happy birthday to her? Her name is Amanda when we get to that part, okay? Feel free to break into chord at any time. Here we go. Or up an octave if you so wish. Here we go. 1, 2.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Amanda. Happy birthday to you.
Now the rest of them are shivering in their Why are there so many songs about rainbows? And what's on the other side? Rainbows catch our awe and imagination. Well, Dorothy believed her dreams would come true over the rainbow. But what did she eventually discover? There's no place like home. Sharon from Finian's Rainbow says, and I searched all over the world and scanned the skies, but I found at last in my true love's eyes. Well, speaking of rainbows, here are 3 charming melodies that capture the color and peaceful experiences that accompany these wonders of nature. First, look to the rainbow, then sing the rainbow, and then somewhere over the rainbow. Let's see what this musical pot of gold has. very loose adaptation of the 1995 Gregory Maguire novel, Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, which, of course, in turn is based on L. Frank Baum's 1900 novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, from which we got the 1939 effect. Now, the musical Wicked offers a unique perspective on the classic tale of Oz, which focuses on the two witches, Elphaba and Glinda, before Dorothy shows up from Kansas. The story examines the complex friendship between Elphaba, who actually becomes the Wicked Witch of the West, and Glinda, who becomes Glinda the Good, and their relationship is tested by their contrasting personalities, conflicting viewpoints, shared love interests, and of course their reaction to the corrupt rule of the wonderful wizard, and ultimately Elphaba's tragic downfall. Now, in a two-part adaptation of the musical Wizard, the first part is coming out in 2 weeks, I believe, theaters near you, directed by John M. Chu and starring Cynthia Erivo as Elphaba and Ariana Grande as Glinda, will be on the big screen. The second part will come a year from now, so you can save up and guess what they is going to be. Now, a little side note, in this selection that the band is going to play, the original version left out Wicked the Musical's most popular song, Popular. So, it turns out that the arranger, Schwartz, actually did a standalone version. And so the band's librarian spent her whole summer, Mindy Howell, spent her whole summer transcribing every note of the standalone piece of Popular into the piece you're going to hear now. So Mindy, you're going to be very popular. All right. Let's hear what you've got to say.
Not much.
evening's performance, let's thank the TCB band who joined us, and also and also Kelly Bennett and Mindy. Thank you for your hard work. And remember, you can get your own director's podium. I see Eli there in the back. Christmas concert, December 7 and 8, same location. Always looking for new members. If you want to join this crazy group, just ask any of them. Y'all have a safe trip.